Thank you for joining us on the Going Deeper podcast, a ministry of Fathom Church in Littleton, Colorado. You will never get to the bottom of the depths that are in Christ for you. And our hope with this podcast is that it will help you go deeper with God. So let's dive into this episode of the Going Deeper podcast. What's up, everyone? This is your host, Kyle Knight, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast. Man, we hope that these conversations help you go deeper in your relationship with God. I'm in the podcast studio here at Fathom Church with our lead pastor, Chris Martin.
Hey,
hi,
buddy.
Chris. Karina Boss, our missions minister, is out today, but
she's on a cruise, dude.
Oh yeah, she's on a cruise. Well, I didn't want to
she's
say like
in
she's
the
on
Caribbean or something.
Yeah, she's somewhere.
Pirates.
It's nice.
Yeah.
Pirates.
That's a
segue into it. No, we're not talking about pirates.
Can you
today.
imagine? This is we're taking a hard left turn on this podcast, and we're doing a podcast about piracy
someday.
And we're not talking about like pirating music. We're talking about pirates, like Blackbeard.
Like pirates. Oh, that's not going to happen. At least today. Not going to happen today. Hey, talking.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Interrupting pirate.
Interrupting pirate.
There's my pirate joke for you.
Let's
get back on track.
We need Karina back. Karina, come back.
That is true.
Yeah, so we are not talking about pirates today. Today we're talking about communion. We just looked it up. We talked about communion maybe 3 years ago on this podcast.
Not this podcast.
A previous podcast that we did. So we have talked about communion before, but it is a good thing to kind of revisit and really re-talk about. So this is a good topic. This is a very interesting topic. So Chris, tell me tell me what is the importance about discussing communion? What is the importance about talking about what communion is, why we do it, all that kind of stuff?
Well, it's important because we practice it every week here at Fathom. It's important because it is historically known as one of the two sacraments of the church. Now, if you come from maybe a Roman Catholic background, there's a lot more sacraments. But Protestant Christians believe in two sacraments, or sometimes they're known as ordinances. But these sacraments are outward expressions of inward realities that Jesus commanded his church to participate in. And so the two sacraments are baptism and the Lord's Supper, or communion. And so why do we talk about it? Because it's a big deal, because Jesus talked about it and participated in it and instituted it. And then the Apostle Paul kind of codified it at some level in the New Testament epistles. And every Sunday here at Fathom, we come to the table after we've heard God's word proclaimed. We eat and we drink and we remember the gospel once again. So I think it's a huge deal for that reason. I do also think that there's just a lot of misunderstanding about it, about what it means, about what's happening. And so I think it's worthwhile to dialogue. Like, why do we do the things that we do? Yep. Well, we do them because they're biblical, they're prescribed in the text, and they are for our good and for God's glory.
That's good. That's a good place to start. We'll get into why the specific way we do it here at Fathom and why we do it that way. But let's start from the simple question of like, what is communion? So like if somebody's maybe listening to this, or we have maybe a new believer to the faith, or someone who is not a believer, come into our church and we do communion at the end of each service after the sermon. How would you explain what communion is? Where did it start? Where did it come from? For those that just might be completely new to this, might not know what it actually is. The Lord's Supper. Yeah. Let's start from the very beginning.
Yeah. Okay. So biblically, right, this shows up in the end of the gospel accounts, at the end of Jesus' life, really the night that he is betrayed. What's going on is Jesus and his followers arrive in Jerusalem a week earlier for the Passover festival. And during the Passover festival, there would have been different meals and different events, as it were, for Jewish men and women to participate in order to remember the Passover event from Exodus, when God rescues his people from slavery. Well, at the Passover dinner, Jesus kind of co-opted the meal at some level with his disciples in the room, and he grabbed a hold of some bread and he said, "This is my body." This is known as the Last Supper. Okay. "This is my body, which is for you." And he broke it and he gave it around to his disciples. And then he took the cup of wine and he said, "This is my blood, which I am going to shed for you." And he passes that drink around and everybody takes a sip. And he essentially kind of takes the Jewish Passover meal, the Last Supper with his disciples, and he turns it into kind of a new thing, which is foreshadowing what's about to happen as Jesus goes to the cross and then rises from the grave 3 days later. Now, early Christians, specifically New Testament Christians, started practicing this. So in what we read every single Sunday in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul says, when you gather together to kind of memorialize the Last Supper at the Lord's table, we eat bread, we drink wine, we kind of do these things in remembrance, in memorial, as it were, of what Jesus did for his disciples, both on that Last Supper, but then what that foreshadowed with his death and his resurrection. So that's kind of the biblical background for it. And Christians have been practicing this since the very beginning. I mean, for 2,000 years of church history, we've been practicing the Lord's Supper. One way that I think is helpful to think about this, like the two sacraments or the two ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper, is like this. Baptism is the sign of the new covenant with a believer. So it's like the reason why you only need to be baptized once is the same reason you only need to be married to your spouse once. It's because once you're married, and the same is true with baptism. It's the initiation into the covenant community of Christ. And so, yes, when you believe on Jesus, that's when you are saved. But when you get into the baptismal waters and get dunked, that's when you declare publicly that you are a part of this, of Christ's body. And then the Lord's Supper, think of it almost like a covenant renewal. Like, so we do this with our membership here, is that you sign the membership covenant once, and then every year we ask you to renew your covenant, to remember, look backwards and remember what you covenanted for, and look forward and agree to continue in that covenant. Think of maybe the Lord's Supper like that in baptism, you are initiated into the covenant community. And then the Lord's Supper every week, you once again commit, you recommit, you reaffirm your covenant. It's covenant renewal every single week, because you remember, I always say, you remember the gospel, you remember the Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and you declare once again that is true of you, that Jesus is your Lord and Savior. You don't get saved again every time you eat the Lord's Supper, but what you do is you reaffirm that covenant. So think of the Lord's Supper as that covenant renewal. Think of baptism as that initiation into the covenant. And I think that helps us then understand the purpose of these two practices within church life.
Yeah, and I think that's good. And that the direction I was going was going to talk about the frequency of doing communion. And you kind of answered that. I mean, here at Fathom, we do it every single week. But speak a little bit into how maybe other denominations or other faiths, kind of how they go about communion and why we do it every single week. I mean, you kind of said it's something that we're remembering, we're doing it every week, but to talk a little bit about the other, maybe other churches and how they do it differently than us and why we do it our specific way of doing it. And then we'll get into, and you could still kind of get into the modes of taking communion as well. There's so many,
lots we could talk about.
If you've been to a different church other than Fathom, you've probably done communion maybe a little bit differently. And we do it our way. So maybe talk about all those kind of differences there. Yeah.
So I'm not well-versed to be able to speak to all of the history on the practice of frequency of communion. So I can't speak to that. I'll just tell you kind of my understanding of modern evangelical practice, so I don't put my foot in my mouth
No, you're
more than
good.
I normally do. Okay. My sense is that in modern kind of evangelical practice, communion has become something that's less frequently practiced in certain contexts, either because of convenience or it's just kind of diminished in it's kind of a more mystical piece of the expression of Christian worship. I mean, singing and praying and like reading the scriptures and stuff like that. Those kind of make more pragmatic sense. But like eating bread and drinking juice or wine feels a little bit like
body and blood of Christ.
I mean, so I understand that at some level churches have moved away from that in probably their attempt to be more, quote, seeker sensitive, seeker friendly. I mean, we've had people who come to our church who are not Christians who are like, why are you drinking blood?
Yeah.
I mean, they mean that literally, like, what is going on here? So it can be a freaky thing. And actually it was for the first century Jews too. So like, yeah, I mean, I get it. But I think, don't quote me on this, but I think historically churches have practiced this as a regular form of worship. Whether it was every week or not, I do not know for sure, but I think it's a really good practice to practice every week. Especially coming from a more pragmatic evangelical background, that might be novel to many of our churchgoers to do it every week. Because some churches do it once a month. It's like, oh, it's Communion Sunday. And some churches do it once a quarter. And I get it, man. Like if you're in a church with like a bigger church, like with 1,000 or 2,000 people, I mean, we use our little pods, but like that's a big undertaking if you want to do it every single week.
Right.
There's a lot of pods. It's a lot of bread. It's a lot of wine. So I get the pragmatics of it, but I think it's a really important practice. And I always say that it's one of the ways that Christ commands us to worship him when we gather together. And there's nothing else in kind of our repertoire of worship that we would say, let's just do it once a month. Like if we'll just sing once a month. Yeah, no, we're not going to pray this week. Prayer Sunday is next week. So there's no prayer today. That's next Sunday when we'll pray. Or like, yeah, we only do sermons on the third Sunday of the month. Like that would never fly. But communion at some level has gotten pushed to the side where we think, oh, well, we can just do this every once in a while. And I understand why. And some people will say, well, you know, it preserves its specialness if we do it, you know, if we do it once in a while as opposed to every week. And I just vehemently disagree. I think it is special every time we do it as a church. And I think the longer you do it, the more that it grows in its specialness. So yeah, like we do it every week because I think that's the best way to do it. And I think people have come to, even people who have been a part of Fathom who didn't want us to do it every week have come around on that. So I think that's a special thing. Yeah. Now to the second part of your question, you asked about like different ways of doing it. Yeah, man, there's some wild stuff in there. Now we use our little, like, you know, prepackaged vacuum sealed, you know, mini cups and pods. I'm calling them the communion pods. Those have not existed, by the way, for very long. Right. So like that's a post-COVID kind of thing that's been real, I think, convenient and nice. But gosh, I mean, I don't know what the earliest mode of communion was. My hunch is that it was common cup. And so common cup is a mode of communion that's still prevalent in a lot of different traditions where you might walk to the front of a sanctuary and receive a little wafer or something like that as your bread, as the body, the representation of the body. And then there's one cup, the common cup full of wine, and the priest or the pastor tips it for you and you take a sip from there, and then he like wipes the lid and turns it 30 degrees, and the next person takes the next sip.
Not very COVID. We're in a post-COVID world now or something. So that
seems. I don't know what those churches are doing post-COVID, but I've been to churches where it's common cup, and man, you just get to the front of the line before everybody else, so you don't get any of the floaties and the end of the cup. And then there are some traditions where literally once they've consecrated the elements, the priest has to drink whatever's left in the common cup because they don't want to pour it out. And so because that's already the blood, as it were. That's already a consecrated element. So you have that spectrum all the way to kind of If you've gone to evangelical churches, there's a method called intinction.
Mhm.
And intinction is, you walk up to the little table and normally there's like a big hunk loaf of like shepherd's bread or something like that. And maybe a cup with some Welch's in it. And you rip a piece of bread off and you dip that in the
Rip and dip.
in the rip and dip,
Oh,
man.
yeah.
You rip
Oh,
it
yeah.
and dip it. It's actually
Don't drop-
called
don't drop
intinction.
Yep.
But that's gross too, because everyone's got their nasty mitts all over that loaf and dipping half of their finger into the common cup of dipping, and it's just it's gross.
Grandma
man.
goes a little too deep into that cup.
Don't double dip in the
Come
communion
on.
cup, So there's kind of, although people have some problems with that in terms of the bread historically is to be unleavened, and so that's obviously like a big fluffy loaf of bread is not what was practiced there. And leaven actually has a symbolic meaning in the practice. Some people use grape juice, some people use wine, like red wine. It just depends on the tradition. Most Baptists, and we are from a Baptistic tradition, most Baptists use grape juice just because of the alcohol issue. But I don't see any problem on either side of that, using grape juice or wine. Gosh, there's lots of ways. Like sometimes in Catholic churches, they put a wafer on your tongue. You don't even touch it. The priest puts it in your mouth. Sometimes you go to a church and they pass these big trays full of, shot glasses with wine and little crackers. And there's lots of different ways to do this. But I don't know that there are right or wrong. There might be better or worse, but I don't think there's really right or wrong.
Yeah. And I think some of those, if you've been a part of different churches and done it kind of some different ways, there's, right or wrong. Like, we're not going to go there, but there's differences in, going up to the front to take it on your own. There's those, the way that like we do is everybody kind of gets it and does it together.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like I grew up where it was all passed out to us, and then we held it and we waited for everybody to take it together. And then I've been in a church where it's when you're ready, like, and we talk about that too with our with how we do our responses and our communion with our kind of the first reflection song and you say it from up there, Chris, too, is hey, take this time to really like get your heart right before you come to the table. And so there's the timing thing of coming up when you're ready and taking communion when you're ready on your own time, that sort of stuff. But also, like, I love how we do it, and we have sort of that kind of processing time, that time to be with God ourselves, but then also to be with, like, to say, hey, we're going to do this together as a church, and we're going to take communion together. As you were kind of talking, I want to just, and you mentioned this at the very beginning of this, and maybe you can go into this a little bit, but I think it's not a silly question, but we kind of like, we laughed at it a little bit, that like some people, like, what do people kind of believe the elements are? Because there are some people that are like, and then some different faiths and religions believe that is the blood and body of Christ. Yep. Others, it's more symbolic. Can you kind of go into what are some of those beliefs around what the actual communion?
Yeah, there's kind of three main takes on it. There's some gradients within this, and I'm no historian or deep theologian in this, but the kind of traditional Roman Catholic belief is known as transubstantiation, which some people might be aware of, where they believe that when you take the elements, they literally become the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah, like they transform.
They transform. They transubstantiate as you take them, and you are genuinely communing on Christ, which sounds kind of creepy, but I mean, when you read the text, Jesus doesn't say, this represents my body.
Right. Yeah.
He says, this is my body.
Yeah.
And so they're taking that really literally. And there's a lot of mystery shrouded in that idea. But that's transubstantiation. To my knowledge, most Protestant Christians reject the idea of transubstantiation. On the far other side of the argument is kind of the idea of symbolism, that the elements are just bread and juice, or bread and wine, and they are symbolic of the body and the blood. They are in memorandum, essentially. They're just there to help you remember and symbolize Christ's life and his death and his resurrection. And so they would say there's nothing mystical, there's nothing going on. It's just a cracker and some juice, and that's it. And we eat and we drink to remember. That's the symbolic side of the argument. In the middle of the argument is where some traditional Lutherans fall. Sometimes it's known as consubstantiation. More often it's known as real presence or actual presence. But what that stance believes is that they use language, my Lutheran friends might scoff because I might get it a little off, but they would say that Christ is actually present at the table, that he is really present, that he is over, under, and within the elements.
I think that's it.
And not that when you take them, it actually turns into like body and blood, like the transubstantiation argument, but that at the table in the elements, you encounter the real presence of Christ in a way that is unique to the table, to the Lord's Supper. And so real presence, it's more than symbolic. It's less than transubstantiation. I feel like we're probably somewhere in between real presence and symbolic. I think we could probably play in both camps pretty well. I actually like the idea of real presence because I do think that something more than just, a cracker and juice is going on there. What that is a big mystery. I'm not quite sure, but Jesus has promised to meet us there. So I like both of those options, but that's my understanding of kind of the spectrum of belief around what's actually going on with the communion elements.
Yeah, that's good. And that's just, I think, good to know and understand of how other people see communion. And last question as we're kind of wrapping up. So from our pastor, those who are listening to this, from our pastor, what would you say to those who are, either I don't know how to put this. When it what about those who are questioning if they should be taking communion, or when's the right time to take communion, or whether it's like their first time either at Fathom or whatever, or they just feel like, hey, you know what, right now I probably shouldn't, do I have to have all my stuff together before I come to the table and before I take communion, before I partake in this? Is that what Jesus would want me to do? As our pastor, what would you say to those who are really thinking about I don't each and every Sunday, I don't know if I should take it right now. Should I be having those questions going on in their head about this sacrament?
Yeah, that's good. I think I would say that the issue of whether or not you take communion, it has less to do with a maturity issue and more to do with a commitment issue. So to the person who says, I'm not sure I'm mature enough, I'm not sure I've worked through stuff enough, I'm not sure I'm worthy enough, I just don't know that that's what communion means. It doesn't mean that you are mature. It doesn't mean that you don't have sin. It doesn't mean that you are that everything's going great. It doesn't mean that everything is working, that everything is that you're active even. It means that you're committed to relying on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for your salvation. So if you've been baptized, as in you have gone public with your commitment to Christ, then I think you should and are welcomed to come to the table anytime, any week, and renew that covenant publicly each Sunday. Now, sometimes families will say, when can my child take communion? And I would answer the same question. I answer that question with the same answer. I think, I'm not going to say this is dogmatic, okay, but I think it's best to wait until your child is baptized. And I think you wait until your child is old enough and mature enough to make that public declaration on their own volition. I think you wait for that moment in baptism and then let them take the Lord's Supper. So Harper has been asking us about taking communion when she sits in service with us sometimes. And we've said, not until you get baptized. And she says, well, when can I get baptized? And I said, well, I mean, we're getting close. Yeah. I think we're getting close with her because I think she genuinely believes. And I think maybe this summer, maybe next summer, we're going to pull the trigger on that. I want to keep that in mind when I'm thinking about the Lord's Supper, that initiation of the covenant happens in baptism and renewal of the covenant happens in the Lord's Supper. So if you are a baptized believer, I think you're welcome to the table, even if stuff's a mess. Now, I do love that we take time to examine yourself, because I think there's a perfect time for examination and introspection and confession and repentance before you come to the Lord's table. I think that's a really good and right thing commanded to us by Paul. We don't take the Lord's Supper flippantly. But if you're like worried, then I think you're probably in the right position to come and once again proclaim, I didn't save myself. Jesus' body, Jesus' blood was poured out for me. So I think if we want to say symbol of communion is, I don't have it all together. I think that's what you're declaring every time you take the Lord's Supper is, if I could save myself, I wouldn't need to eat this meal. And you can't. And so you need to.
That's good stuff.
It's good, man.
That's good stuff right there. That's all the time we have for this episode. Hey, thanks, Pastor Chris, for talking about this. Hey, thank you, church, for listening. Hopefully this helped you. Hopefully this helped you understand a little bit more of why we do communion, how we do communion. And again, reach out if you have any questions about any of this stuff. But we love you, church. We hope to see you here on Sunday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.